print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Jeff Shapiro, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the August 8th, 9th issue of the Wall Street Journal Review and the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The Spanish border chaos illusion. Europe's borders are finally working. Viral images of 72,000 migrants stampeding into Ceuta looked like a security collapse. In reality, it revealed Europe's much harder line on immigration. It was like scenes from a movie about Europe's dystopian future. Wave after wave of mostly young men from North Africa pouring into European territory. So many people kept swimming around a breakwater of rocks at the border that, in their rush to get out, they climbed over others trapped underneath, drowning scores. Crowds forced open other parts of the frontier, and border guards watched helplessly as an estimated 72,000 people jubilantly came in, some shouting, "Viva España!" The images from the Spanish enclave of Ceuta in North Africa last month went viral almost instantly, shaping up as a moment of global humiliation for Spain and its left-wing Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez. Anti-immigration parties and leaders across Europe, as well as President Trump and Elon Musk, said it was the ultimate symbol of Europe's soft-hearted inability to contain immigration. Trump and Musk called it a literal invasion, citing the numbers of military-age young men. Italy dramatically reimposed border checks with Spain to ensure none of the arrivals would enter Italian soil. But that take part proved short-lived. The new arrivals were not welcomed with open arms. There were no waiting refugee camps with beds and hot meals. Shops quickly shut to prevent looting, making it difficult for the arrivals to eat or drink water. Some locals turned up with makeshift weapons to protect their stores, and within a day, tens of thousands of those who crossed had begun to return meekly on their own. Heavily armed Spanish troops frog-marched most of the rest back to the Moroccan border, no questions asked. Morocco did not object. Within days, an estimated 70,000 had gone back, leaving about 2,000 in Ceuta, according to the Spanish government. Many of those are unaccompanied minors who will eventually be returned to Morocco after the Spanish officials locate their families, while some sub-Saharan Africans will be put in a nearby migrant camp. None can leave Ceuta for mainland Spain or elsewhere in Europe without a visa check. That means it's unlikely more than a few will ever set foot in mainland Europe. Questions remain about who organized the mass crossings and whether the Moroccan government is guilty of either stoking it or allowing it to happen unimpeded. But a week later, it seems more like a spontaneous rush to the border than a long-planned attempt to emigrate. Migrants crossing the Darien Gap or Mexico travel with documents, money, and spare clothes. These turned up with flip-flops. Crazy as it seems, the whole episode also suggests something unexpected. Europe, having struggled to cope with a surge in illegal immigration over the past 11 years, is making progress securing its borders, though too belatedly for many of its voters. Even Spain's Sánchez, the self-positioned flag-bearer of a new anti-nationalist left, has quietly taken a hard line on asylum seekers. The irony here is that this is an incident had almost no impact on immigration in Europe in the end, but the images will endure and will fuel the sense of loss of control over borders among European countries, said Andrew Seeley, head of the Migration Policy Institute, which advises several governments. The real lesson of this, which policymakers largely got back but the public didn't, is that the control mechanism worked. Most European countries eventually congratulated Spain for handling the crisis quickly. Spain has now erected new barriers along the breakwater to deter future crossers. For Europe as a whole, the number of those arriving illegally has fallen sharply over the past 2 years to 177,000 last year from 380,000 in 2023, according to Frontex, Europe's border and coast guard agency. By comparison, the U.S. registered about 130,000 encounters of people crossing the U.S.-Mexico border illegally in the past year, a similar level when adjusted for Europe's bigger population. That is far fewer than the millions coming across during the Biden administration, and many arrivals are now turned around at the frontier rather than processed for asylum. European countries aren't turning everyone back who makes it, but they are making harder to claim asylum, and they're holding growing number of asylum seekers in detention camps while their claims are assessed, at least for up to 6 months. They are tightening border security and outsourcing enforcement downstream to neighboring countries where migrants must cross, be it Morocco, Libya, or Turkey, in return for money, visas, or security cooperation. By every measure, Europe has not had this much control over illegal migration in a decade, Magnus Brunner, the EU's Commissioner for Migration, said earlier this week, but the events from Ceuta show that dramatic images beat the best statistics. Consider Spain. The country has taken an open border policy toward Latin Americans, most of whom can enter visa-free and apply for citizenship after just 2 years of legal residence. It's a ready-made labor force for an aging economy that shares language, culture, and religion, and is therefore less controversial for Spanish voters. Not so for migrants from elsewhere. Before Sanchez took office, he railed against the barbed wire fence crisscrossing Ceuta's ridgeline, claiming that Spain had a moral duty toward refugees. Yet over his 8-year term, Spain's grant rate for asylum seekers has dropped to 12% from a previous 35%, far below that of many other countries, including the U.S. And the 19-foot-tall barbed wire Sanchez campaigned to remove has been replaced by an even taller set of 3 fences, the highest reaching 33 feet, twice the height of the more well-known barrier built in Hungary by former Prime Minister Viktor Orban. By comparison, Trump's border works top out at 30 feet, and aren't as densely outfitted with thermal cameras and motion detectors. It's a border fence that Trump can only dream of, says Ana Terron, a former Spanish immigration minister. As anyone who has tried to hold Europe in the board game Risk can attest, the continent is geographically harder to seal off than North America or Australia. Its east rolls through vast steppes, easily crossed by centuries of invading armies. The waters between Turkey and Greece are dotted with endless tiny islands, as Odysseus learned the hard way, many of them reachable by rowboat. Spanish and Italian agencies have to monitor the Sahara, a desert larger than the European Union, and the Mediterranean. Then there are the overseas territories, which require France to post immigration officers across 12 time zones, including the jungled 450 miles between French Guiana and Brazil. It's also more difficult for Europe to act in concert. The U.S. is a single country. The EU has 27, each with its own laws and politics. Europe, unlike the U.S., was long a land of emigration, not immigration, sending millions to the Americas and overseas empires. And until the end of the Cold War, most European countries were fairly homogeneous. France and Britain housed small communities from former colonies, an immigration pattern so mundane that 1960s France let citizens of former West African colonies fly into Paris without passports. It was, paradoxically, the erasure of border controls within Europe that led to its first attempts to seriously tighten its borders beyond. In the 1990s, as remnants of the Berlin Wall were chiseled into souvenirs, a reunited Germany started assembling a passport-free travel zone with France and its neighbors. A seamless grid of autobahns and high-speed rail linking a transnational union no longer scarred by checkpoints and exit visas. The catch was that any one external border was now every country's border. The new EU stepped in to help build border fences, including an 8-foot tall barrier in 1995 to replace the rusting chest-high wire that Cordon Ceuta off from Morocco. Spain called it waterproofing the border, and almost immediately Spanish lawmakers started to debate a taller fence. Spiraling debt crises were forcing West African countries, Ghana, Senegal, Nigeria, to lay off state workers who struggled to land jobs in the private sector. Migration began replacing public service as the means of advancement. Globalization suddenly gave money and means for people to move. Smuggling networks rose up. Smartphones provided instant feedback on the best routes. Remittances flowed into remote villages where the most reliable way to reinvest the windfall was to send another family member across the Sahara. Both Europe and the U.S. saw a sharp increase in numbers of residents born outside the country. And since 1990, the percentage of foreign-born population in the U.S. has risen from 9.2% to 15.2%, close to levels in the 1920s that prompted a backlash. In Britain, it went from 6.4% to 17.1%, and in Germany, from 8.7% to 19.8%, though in both cases, about a third of those came from other European countries. Even if governments cut back new arrivals, it could take years before the tensions fade. Adding to the problem, many voters in Europe and the U.S. feel that they've had no say in this transformation. People in most developed countries feel like immigration is happening to them rather than something that they are choosing, said Seeley. The frustration turned once fringe parties into the leading opposition in France and Germany. In Britain, it delivered Brexit to give the country what other EU countries lacked, control over the national borders. But then the Conservative government of Boris Johnson, having shut off access for European migrants, opened the doors to the rest of the world, sparking record levels of legal immigration. Tens of thousands of asylum seekers followed, arriving on small boats from France. Having left the EU, the UK has little sway over Paris in getting them to stop the boats. The public is fuming. Immigration is the top voter concern in the polls. And though the Labour government has sharply slashed both legal and illegal immigration, it runs neck and neck in polls with the anti-immigration party, Reform UK, while the new, harder right party, Restore Britain, is gaining ground. Europe's current immigration system is a hall of mirrors. Liberal leaders like Sanchez oust conservatives on a vow to welcome refugees, only to crack down later once confronted by the cold reality of foreign men massing toward their borders. On the right, past prime ministers from Britain's Johnson to Hungary's Orban have sworn to resist multiculturalism, only to quietly preside over record-busting levels of legal immigration that keep pensions funded and low-wage jobs filled. Migrants fib their way through an asylum system whose administrators can't possibly check whether each claim of persecution is the faraway land and is true. Voters tell pollsters that they want stricter borders, but also things like affordable groceries, made possible in part by cheap immigrant labor. Take Poland, where the 2015 migrant crisis helped usher in the conservative nationalist Law and Justice Party, which vowed to protect the 98% Catholic country from mass migration. But then it faced the labor strains of a nation whose economy had grown 15-fold since 1990, while the population barely budged. And from 2017 to 2022, the nationalist government awarded more first-time residence permits to arrivals from outside the EU than any other European country. Now, Poland is led by a pro-European centrist party that has quietly tripled forcible deportations, creating a precedent that Germany's far right hopes to test. For all the noise and electoral tumult, immigration remains Europe's most widely debated issue and one where governments of all stripes now broadly agree. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review and the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The turning point was the 2015 crisis, when more than 1 million people, most fleeing Syria's civil war, poured into Europe. That September, Angela Merkel resolved to welcome them in Germany and took a viral selfie with a teenage Syrian. But within weeks, Merkel flew to Turkey, agreeing to give billions of euros to a country drifting into autocracy for its security forces to stop more from coming. The EU, once a reliable source of pressure for Turkey to hold more competitive elections, suddenly had a stake in regime stability. For Turkish liberals, it amounted to a European nail through their democratic hopes. For Europe's liberals, it would become a playbook. And in 2017, Italy's then center-left government struck a controversial deal with Libyan authorities in Tripoli. Italy provides financial and technical support to the Libyan Coast Guard, which in turn intercepts boats and returns migrants to mainland Libya. A UN report accused the loosely organized forces of shooting at vessels and packing migrants into a system of rudimentary jails where they were extorted, beaten, and used for forced labor. Arrivals from Libya plummeted. Italy periodically renews the deal. Now, Europe's land borders are nearly all barricaded by imposing fences. The EU's European Commission once compared such structures to the Berlin Wall. These days, it helps outfit them with AI-powered surveillance equipment. From Scandinavia to left-wing Spain, some of the most human rights-minded governments coordinate to get the less scrupulous governments across the Mediterranean to perform the grunt work the European voters don't want to see their own border guards engaged in. Governments across Europe are generally moving in a more restrictive direction, hoping that they can see off the populace, says Alan Manning, the former head of the UK's Migration Advisory Council, which advises the government on migration policy. It's all too late for many voters who have watched Mohammed overtake Noah as England's most common newborn boy's name, or Syrians reshape Germany's demographic landscape. Spain has financed and supplied Morocco with border control equipment and invested on big projects, including a new railway. Morocco gets first dibs on temporary work visas in areas like agriculture. And in exchange, Spain can return any Moroccan that illegally enters Ceuta and its sister enclave, Melilla, unless they are minors. And Morocco enforces its own borders to prevent people from sub-Saharan Africa from crossing toward Spain. The strategy does not come without risks. Spain's arrangement has given asymmetric leverage to its smaller, poorer neighbor. Morocco claims Ceuta and Melilla as its own, and in effect, Spain is counting on a historical rival that covets its territory to protect that same territory. Europe's age-old rivalries, muted for years, are reasserting themselves in the politics of immigration. Turkey periodically allows migrants into Greece, with which it has long-running disputes over Aegean waters and islands. And in late 2021, Belarus, with Vladimir Putin's support, bussed Middle Eastern immigrants to the Polish border, distracting Europe from the Russian president's ominous massing of troops near the Ukraine. Perhaps the last lesson from Ceuta is that, thanks to social media, immigration is now far more visible in real time than ever before, whether it's Moroccans pouring into Ceuta, migrant caravans snaking their way through Mexico, or dinghies crammed with men floating toward England. These images matter. The migrant caravans helped propel Trump back into office. If Europe's centrists want to prevent far-right parties from taking power, then they need to try to win the argument beyond numbers, because every picture of a migrant boat probably stays with voters longer than border crossing statistics. Ariana Grande, In the Shadow of My Own Thinness, by Ruth Friedlander. The discourse around celebrity weight loss misses the point. The hardest conversations are the ones that we owe to the people right next to us. I was 8 years old, sitting in a classroom, taking a turn that was still 10 kids away. We were reading The Secret Garden out loud, round robin, and I was bored. It was almost summer. I looked down at my legs. When I pressed my thigh flat against the chair seat, it spread. I don't think I had ever noticed this before. It looked to me like a slab of meat in a butcher's case, some flabby offshoot that had nothing to do with the leg that it was attached to. Absent-mindedly, or maybe not at all, I took my Bic pen and drew a line on my skin from my knee up to where I thought my leg should be. A straight line, the leg I was supposed to have. I spent the next 20 years trying to live inside that line. It was about the food, and it was not about the food. It was about being thin, and it was not remotely about being thin. What it was, for 2 decades, was the majority of my brain. A running occupancy of thoughts about my body, my weight, and the distance between what I was and what I had decided I should be. I was 28 before a single person sat me down and had anything resembling a serious conversation with me about it. I worked in fashion. I had roommates, boyfriends, best friends, and involved parents. But there's no protocol for well-meaning mothers who suspect something about their 20-something, who pays her own rent, doesn't miss work, and answers all her calls. I think about that now, watching the internet talk about Ariana Grande. Since the first Wicked press tour in 2024, Grande has been the subject of much speculation about her weight. But the real fever pitch reached last week after Grande released a music video for her latest single, Pedal. The video shows Grande as an aspiring actress, auditioning in front of a table of men, scrawling notes like, "Lovely voice, very kind, but nothing special. It couldn't hurt to lose a few pounds." This, all while Grande dances and sings desperately, bony clavicle, as in your face as it could be. Immediately following the Pedal video release, it seemed a new level of concern had been reached. Fans, their parents, and eating disorder recovery advocates were scared, making comparisons to Karen Carpenter, the 70s musical icon who died of anorexia nervosa at the age of 32. TikTokers went on green screen asking when enough would be enough. And then a representative for Grande announced that she'd be taking a break from the public eye, finishing her tour but canceling her much-anticipated London performance in Sunday in the Park with George. Boundaries need to be set, Grande explained a day later on stage. Human beings can need a break sometimes. She did not comment on her health or directly address her fans' concerns, but many people are still reading or writing in between the lines. The discourse has arranged itself, as per usual, into 2 competing camps. One is speculating in public about a woman's health. The other has reminded us all of a rule largely born of the body positivity movement, and one I learned and swore by post-treatment myself, that we don't comment on bodies. Full stop. In treatment, it was posited to us this way: how bizarre that we feel comfortable going up to people and talking to them about their bodies. And also, isn't somebody's body the least interesting thing about them? Ask them about their interests, their life, their relationships, their favorite book. The no body commentary is all presented as the compassionate position and has the great advantage of being easy to follow. Up until the big O, I've lived by that rule. Ozempic onset weight loss forced people like me, who live in a recovery-first reality, to reassess what felt right and what didn't when talking about bodies. More and more people in my daily life were showing up looking completely different, and to not acknowledge that at all made me feel a little crazy. When we're waiting at lunch for a friend who then shows up looking like they body swapped, are we still expected to say nothing? when does saying nothing become inauthentic? I want to make it clear that the first camp is doing harm. There's no reality in which gossiping about someone's weight loss, especially on social media, is a way toward helping or healing. Nobody knows what is happening in anyone else's body. I don't, and I've lived it. Speculation is not care. It's entertainment that has learned to speak in a sympathetic voice, and the people it hurts most are not celebrities. It's the people reading the comments and taking notes on what's get noticed. I've come to believe that the second camp, the one I so comfortably lived within for the past decade, can no longer be the answer to the first. The blanket rule is not a moral position. It's a manners position. Nobody in my life was cruel to me about my body. That is the part people misunderstand. What I got instead was a very long, very polite silence, a room full of people who could talk and laugh together, but who had also been taught that bodies are private, that commenting is rude, and that the kind of thing is to say nothing. Silence is comfortable, albeit deafening. That's the whole appeal. When I say I wish someone had spoken to me at 15, I'm not wishing someone had told me I looked sick. In honesty, that probably would have made me proud. I'm wishing someone had been willing to be uncomfortable in a room with me. Now here's where I live, where I have to indict myself, because I've been on the other side of this and I have been no better. I have still sat across from friends who lost a startling amount of weight in a startling amount of time and said nothing, not once, but repeatedly. Dramatic weight loss no longer means what it used to mean in the Ozempic era. It might be a prescription, it might be grief or divorce or a thyroid or none of my business. The honest answer is that I frequently cannot tell the difference between concern and projection, between worrying about my friend and being unsettled by watching a body change in a way my own history has trained me to read as danger. And some of it is just cowardice. You tell yourself you're respecting her privacy. Ironically, the blanket silence has given the people with the least standing, strangers on the internet, permission to speak, while the people with the most standing, the ones actually in the room, hold their tongues out of respect. That's backward. If you don't know a woman, her body is not your subject. And if you do know her, silence is not neutrality. It is a choice with consequences, and you should at least make it knowingly. I don't know anyone who is close to Grande or what, if anything, any of them have said to her in private. I'm assuming neither do you, and neither does anyone posting about it. What I know is that somebody is close enough, somebody always is. In my case, dozens of people were, and for 20 years, and I chose to believe what every one of them was doing what they believed was a decent thing. That takes about 4 seconds to say. It cost me 20 years to hear it. I didn't realize how addicted I was to my poem until I went to prison. By P.J. Sittenfeld. A former Cincinnati politician writes about the irony of his involuntary separation from his constantly chirping device. Sitting in a car in a McDonald's parking lot in January of 2024, I made a final call to my wife, Sarah, to tell her I loved her. It was the first time I'd been in possession of my iPhone before self-surrendering to the Federal Correction Institution in Ashland, Kentucky. My aunt and my sister Curtis were with me. The prison was just a 5-minute drive away. Sarah had stayed behind in Cincinnati, where we live, in part to preserve as much normalcy as possible for our young sons. Saying goodbye to them had been the single most anguishing moment of my entire life. Before incarceration, I was a member of Cincinnati City Council for a decade. In 2018 and 2019, I'd been gearing up to run for mayor when the FBI targeted me in an elaborate sting operation. Undercover agents posing as real estate investors made campaign donations, which I believed to be ordinary and routine and disclosed in public filings. Federal prosecutors nonetheless indicted me on public corruption charges alleging a quid pro quo. After a 3-week trial, I was acquitted on 4 counts and convicted on 2, after which a judge sentenced me to a 16-month term of incarceration. Later in the surreal saga, I was pardoned by the president in 2025 And in April of this year, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously vacated my convictions. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Going to prison meant many things: an immediate loss of freedom, bruising reputational damage, and powerlessness over how it would affect my family. It also meant that for the first time in the decade and a half since I first got a smartphone, I'd be forced to disconnect. As in the case for the majority of Americans, my cell phone was particularly a bodily appendage. According to screen time surveys and data analysts, adults in the U.S. now spend north of 4 hours a day on our phones. We check them more than 10 times an hour and don't stop even while watching TV, out on dates, or driving. I was no exception. Whenever mine would buzz or chirp, I'd immediately shift my attention from whatever I was doing to the incoming stimuli, even though the pings were not always time-sensitive. Work emails, updates from our children's school, relentless spam from political campaigns. Yes, even people who've held office hate these. Sarah and I would also exchange at least a dozen text messages in the course of coordinating our days. Her from her hospital job as an oncologist, me from City Hall, and from around town as I met with constituents, visited neighborhood business districts, and did community safety walks. As my sentence loomed, the messages between us were often shot through with tenderness, an unprompted "I love you" for no particular reason. At the prison, one of the first things I saw was a poster warning inmates and their visitors against and threatening punishment for bringing contraband, including phones, onto the compound. I felt my inability to reach Sarah acutely. Following a customary invasive strip search, I was led on a tour of the prison compound by an inmate who introduced me to other inmates and took me to my cell, an 8 by 10 foot cubicle that I was to share with another man in prison parlance known as once Sally. As I took in my new surroundings, all I wanted was to call, or at least text Sarah to say, "I feel physically safe. The men I'm meeting so far have been kind to me, and most of all, I miss you so much." But I had no means of doing so at first. Soon, I'd see inmates unveil smartphones all around me. The economy inside prisons is an incredible testament to the power of capitalism and how creatively goods will flow to those who want them, so long as the buyer can make it worth it for the seller. Several men, knowing I was new, offered to let me use their smartphone to FaceTime Sarah. The idea of seeing her made me feel anxious desperation. But I decided ahead of time on a handful of priorities for navigating prison, and number one on the list was get home. I wouldn't do anything that could risk extending my stay or prolonging my sentence. I would not physically fight with another inmate, even if provoked. I would not mess around with any contraband, including phones. Being caught with a phone was the most frequent reason that inmates at my prison were sent to the special housing unit, also called the hole, where prisoners could be kept for 23 hours a day in a small cell. But it was clear from that first night on that many men chose to have a contraband phone, accepting the risk, in large part to keep in touch with their families. In the evenings, when there were fewer guards around and the patrols were more predictable, my housing unit was filled with the sounds of men sharing the latest prison gossip with their wives and girlfriends, asking their children what they did at school that day, and checking in on aging parents. I especially empathize in these moments with the men whose sentences put them in the category of long-termers. Of course, smartphone usage wasn't exclusively wholesome. Men would also scroll YouTube videos, partake in online sports betting, and persuade women on the outside to date them, sometimes seemingly to get those women to wire money into their commissary accounts. Still, part of the demand was the unappealing conditions of the alternative, the prison phone room. Just off the yard, this small, dingy room contained 10 partitioned payphone-style phones along 3 of the walls. On any given day, between 2 and 5 of them were broken. Especially during high traffic times, after waiting in line, you'd pick up a phone still warm from the grip of the inmate who'd just been using it, the receiver still smelling like his breath. You'd stand just inches from another man while you both had conversations with loved ones that were often deeply personal. The connection was frequently lousy, and every 5 minutes an automated voice would interrupt to announce this call is from a federal prison, as though either party on the line needed reminding. My ability to speak and to hear Sarah and our son's voices was limited to around 15 minutes a day, and talking to them for that period of time, often around dinner, left 0 minutes to speak with my mother, my 3 sisters, or any other family members or friends. Prison guards would spend hours every weekend tearing literal holes in the walls of the housing units looking for spots where men might be storing their smartphones. Sometimes, before the daily tallies that occurred to ensure all inmates were accounted for, they would jokingly call out, "It's count time, guys. Go ahead and hide your cell phones." The prison I was kept in was nowhere near one of the worst. I was detained in a minimum security camp, but I saw up close how thoroughly the system deprives people from the lifelines of family connection that they truly need. Through months without a smartphone, I learned another thing much more unexpected. My brain, if not my heart, felt a lot better without it. At first, I thought it was a function of wide open days unfurling before me. I'd gone from a high-intensity profession, a full family and social life, and various volunteer commitments, all frenetically coordinated through my smartphone, to the unstructured rhythms of prison. But as my confinement continued, even though my longing to be home, I felt an indisputable change that could only be tied to the lack of a smartphone. Phone-induced distractedness, flusteredness, and agitation had been constants in life before prison, and without a device constantly jostling my brain and interrupting my thoughts, I became more alert to what was happening around me. I sensed my surroundings. I became better at noticing. As winter gave way to spring, I tracked the almost hourly change in blossoming trees beyond the fences, grateful to see the physical manifestation of new beginnings. I discussed and debated life's big questions on foundational topics with my cellie. The complication of family dynamics, our greatest fears and regrets, our deepest longings for the future. I wrote poetry, something I'd never done before or since. In prison every night, as phones emerged from their hiding places and my housing unit filled with a cacophony of men facing time and watching YouTube clips and playing music videos, I think of a simple piece of advice that another inmate had given me soon after I had arrived in prison. Do your time, bro, rather than letting your time do you. Alas, this is not a tale of transformation. 4.5 months into my incarceration, in an incredibly rare occurrence in our legal system, 3 federal judges ordered my immediate release after hearing oral arguments in my appeal. The outcome of my case was still pending, but I was home. As I resettled into the life I had so missed, I had first tried to avoid the agitating, distracting, and intrusive pull of my phone. I simply did what so many of us always have the option to do but can't or won't. I kept my phone on Do Not Disturb, put it in another room, and left it behind at home when we went out for a family walk or meal. But within just a few months, I'd reverted my old habits, immediately glancing at and engaging with every ping and alert, and reflexively picking up my phone to scroll through my rotation of go-to websites. It's an irony I'm still grappling with, a kind of freedom I learned in prison that I couldn't manage to bring back home with me. Mahjong swept summer camp this year. Is canasta next? How an almost 200-year-old game became a hot commodity for teenagers. Samson Durham and his bunkmates at Camp Harlem typically pick rock wall climbing or free swim as their Saturday elective. This summer, 10-year-old Samson persuaded his friends to join him in the rec hall for mahjong lessons. His friends were skeptical. He wanted them to sit inside and learn a tile game. Soon they were hooked. Since Camp Harlem introduced mahjong lessons as an elective this summer, word spread like wildfire among campers, said Ellie Tepper-Schulman, Associate Director of the overnight camp in Kunkletown, Pennsylvania. as well as its resident mahjong instructor. She said the campers and staff alike were playing the game at all hours. It isn't just Camp Harlem. Across the Northeast and New England, summer camps have hired mahjong instructors to lead clinics and are incorporating play into daily schedules. Staffers are teaching lessons during rest hours or choice time, and parents are getting requests for mahjong sets. At camps where no instructor is on the schedule, teens are bringing their own sets and recruiting their peers. I still consider the game something played by women of older generations, said Lauren Perlin, co-executive director of Camps Erie and Louise in Western Maryland. But she recently asked campers if they play mahjong, and tons of hands went up. I was shocked, Perlin said. She's considering adding to the schedule next summer. Generations of adults remember being shooed from their mothers' and grandmothers' games of mahjong, which originated in 19th century China and gained popularity among U.S. women around the 1920s, with a version that differs mostly in its use of a card listing winning hands that change annually. Now, as its popularity surges, it's a favorite at family game night, a multi-generational activity that can keep everyone off their phones. Ella Velarudu, who's 14 years old, learned in May that her camp, Pine Forest in Pennsylvania, would be hosting a 2-day mahjong clinic. Campers were encouraged to bring their sets. Ella's mother taught her, and she often plays with friends at home in Miami Beach, but doubted that her camp friends would be interested, so she didn't bring her set. That changed when professional mahjong instructor Samantha Richmond taught campers ages 13 to 15. Before the clinic, it was hard to convince them to play, but once they started learning, you could tell that they really wanted to win. Ella said of her friends, they asked her if her mom could bring the set and 4 mahjong cards for visiting day, she added. Ella's mother, 46-year-old Lori Maltz, said that she is surprised but pleasantly shocked that her teenager and friends enjoy it so much. As a kid, Maltz recalled, she wasn't even allowed in the room when my mom played with her friends, and she had no interest in learning mahjong until a year ago. Now she regularly plays with both her mom and daughter and has been a connection for the 3 generations. In July, Trails End Camp in Beach Lake, Pennsylvania, held its first 2-day mahjong clinic for the 75 girls in entering 9th through 11th grades. They didn't want to stop, said Sammy Linden, assistant director of Teen Girls. Sasha Rand, who's 14 years old, took her pink travel mahjong set to Camp Nakamixon near Allentown, Pennsylvania, armed with a cheat sheet so the newbies could easily see which suits go together. Sasha was well versed in teaching the game, from showing elementary-age kids how to do it at the Tile Society in her hometown of Wyckoff, New Jersey. Wendy Siegel, owner and director and resident mahjong instructor of Tyler Hill Camp in Wayne County, Pennsylvania, said, "There's something about sitting around a table, talking, and using their brains that kids are looking for. They want to do something that has stood the test of time for generations." Last year, Siegel taught the oldest boys canasta, another game popular among retirees, but a hit with the campers. Siegel might have unwittingly spotted the next hot thing. At Camp Wakanda in New York's Catskill Mountains, professional canasta instructor Lisa Youngelson, also the camp's activities director, taught the card game to the female counselors in training. On visiting day, Yogelson was inundated with appreciation from their families. Parents came up and hugged me, saying, "We're so excited our daughter is learning how to play canasta," she recalled. "It's a thing that brings people together." The following is an article from the books section of the Wall Street Journal Review. Pitch Perfect. Biomechanical analysis helps pitchers reach new levels of velocity. Batters are challenged like never before. You're listening or reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. In his 2003 book, Moneyball, Michael Lewis spent far more pages on hitting than pitching. Mr. Lewis documented how Billy Beane, the general manager of the Oakland Athletics, seemed to have figured out offense by emphasizing slugging and on-base percentage over batting average. But pitching was a mystery that couldn't be solved. Pitching was more art than science. Mr. Lewis likened pitchers to writers. They had all sorts of ways of achieving their effects, and they needed to be judged by those effects rather than by their outward appearance or their technique. To place a premium on velocity for its own sake was like placing a premium on a big vocabulary for its own sake. To say all pitchers should pitch like Nolan Ryan was as absurd as insisting that all writers should write like John Updike. But Major League Baseball today isn't defined by crafty wordsmiths on the mound with their own styles. The sport now cultivates clones of Mr. Ryan throwing as hard as possible with maximum spin on the ball. In Unhittable, Rob Friedman tracks the transformation of pitching from art into science. Mr. Friedman runs the Pitching Ninja account on X, an entertaining scroll of nasty pitches and baffled hitters that he started in 2014. Pitching Ninja was a hobby that turned into an obsession, first for Mr. Friedman and then for members of the baseball media and the players themselves. Matthew Liberatore, a young lefty for the St. Louis Cardinals, was thrilled when his curveball was featured on Pitching Ninja. He knew it meant that he had finally arrived. Mr. Friedman offers a close look at the pitching revolution. We learn how pitchers use data from sites such as Baseball Savant to find out how fast that they're throwing, how much spin that they are getting on their pitches, and how hitters are reacting. We hear from Tariq Skubal, perhaps the best pitcher in the sport, who used biomechanical analysis to reach 100 miles an hour on his fastball. Mr. Skubal, who has recently traded to the Los Angeles Dodgers from the Detroit Tigers, worked with a pair of Tigers pitching coaches who were obsessed with motion capturing systems such as Hawkeye to refine his mechanics. Now I feel like I just throw the ball as hard as I want to, and it's going to go over the plate. Mr. Skubal tells the author, retired pitchers can only marvel. Imagine being able to see exactly how your body moves and where energy is lost. Says David Cohn, no slouch in his younger days. It's incredible what pitchers today can do with that information. One thing technology hasn't done is keep pitchers healthy. The unnatural act of throwing a baseball still tears the tendons and wrenches elbows. Pitchers today are encouraged to go all out on every pitch. They are assured that they won't need to remain in a game for as long as past pitchers who had to mete out velocity judiciously so they could finish 9 innings. This is one area where modern pitchers aren't like Mr. Ryan, who routinely completed the games. When today's starters exit a game, they are simply replaced by a bullpen arm who comes in and does the same thing. Maximize effort for velocity and spin on every pitch. Relievers used to be pitchers who weren't good enough to be starters. Now they are flamethrowers and shorter stints. While advancements in biomechanics and technology have significantly improved our understanding of pitching mechanics and performance optimization, Mr. Friedman writes, the injury bug remains elusive. In recent years, Mr. Friedman emphasizes pitchers have begun to dominate the game. The league-wide batting average this year has hovered in the low 240s, down from 269 in 2006. Compared with 20 years ago, there are now more strikeouts and fewer runs scored in each game. The collective earned run average for pitchers has dropped more than half a run. There are drawbacks to the pitching revolution. Joe Sheehan, a baseball writer, has observed that the sport's real watchability problem isn't pace of play but lack of action. In a world where pitchers are this good, hitters have to sell out for power, hoping that they luck into a mistake pitch and hit it over the fence, rather than engage in a cerebral battle with the pitcher. An increasing number of at-bats end in a walk, strikeout, or home run, plays that require no significant action in the field. The pitchers, the coaches, and technicians who speak with Mr. Friedman offer remarkable insight. Tom House, who worked on biomechanics with Mr. Ryan decades before the rest of the sport caught on, comes across as a shaman-like character. House looked at everything the author writes: mechanics, functional strength, nutrition, sleep, recovery, mental focus. It was all part of the equation. Mr. Friedman devotes a chapter to Paul Skeens, the star right-hander currently pitching for the Pittsburgh Pirates. Before joining the majors, Mr. Skeens worked at Louisiana State University's pitching lab with his coach, Wes Johnson. The lab allowed Johnson and Skeens to analyze every aspect of his delivery in three dimensions, pinpointing the inefficiencies and opportunities for improvement, Mr. Freeman writes. Mr. Skeens learned to generate more force with his pitches by subtly adjusting his front-side landing mechanics, enhancing both his philosophy and his command. Mr. Friedman's book is full of techno-corporate prattle. His writing is what we expect from someone who built a company into a global data powerhouse, reshaping how online businesses understood their users. He also has a tendency to get starry-eyed around big-name pitchers. His awe of Mr. Screwball verges on sycophantic. But Mr. Friedman is well situated to explain how the sport has changed in the 2 decades since Moneyball. If you want to understand modern baseball, whether you like it or not, Unhittable is an instructive guide. This is another book, Matters of Mind and Heart, by Hannah Arendt, by Thomas Mayer. On the passenger list of the Guinée, which sailed from Lisbon for New York on May 10, 1941, Henrik Blücher appeared as a 41-year-old author and Hannah Arendt simply as his 34-year-old wife. Though both were born in Germany, Arendt's paperwork recorded her as Hebrew, while both were listed as stateless. And before Arendt became the great thinker of statelessness, bureaucracy had compressed her into these terms. Thomas Mayer's Hannah Arendt, A Life of the Mind, returns her thought to a world in which a few words on a form could decide a life. Expertly translated from the German by Shelley Frisch, the book is the first scale Arendt biography since Elizabeth Young Bruhl's 1982 account. Young Bruhl, who studied philosophy under Arendt, possessed the advantages of discipleship and living memory. Mr. Meyer draws on later correspondence, archives, unpublished writings, and his experience editing a 12-volume German edition of Arendt's work. His archival discoveries changed the shape of her story. His biography can be episodic, with his documentary findings sometimes presented without much interpretation. Yet he produces a fresh Arendt, less alone intelligence surveying the 20th century catastrophes from above than a participant in battered institutions. Mr. Meyer begins with her apprenticeship in belonging. Born in 1906 into an assimilated German-Jewish family, Arendt grew up in Königsberg, then the capital of East Prussia in the German Empire, under the political tutelage of her mother, Martha. Königsberg, the home of Immanuel Kant, supplied a civic vocabulary, law, citizenship, and Bildung, the ideal of self-cultivation. Mr. Meyer is especially good on the family history that made Jewish emancipation appear durable. For Arendt's grandfather, Max, Mr. Meyer writes, Zionism punctured the belief that one could be on an equal footing as a Jew, as a citizen, and as a German. And by the 1930s, that assurance belonged to history. Arendt would later write with matches severity about statelessness and the right to have rights. Here, those abstractions acquire prehistory in German-Jewish arrangements that proved disastrously brittle. Before Nazi Germany revoked her civic belonging, universities offered Arendt a more exalted citizenship. From 1924 to 1928, she studied philosophy with Martin Heidegger, Edmund Husserl, and Karl Jaspers. Heidegger became both teacher and lover. Arendt later told him that her 1958 book, The Human Condition, owed him practically everything. His embrace of Nazism in 1933, however, embodied what Arendt eventually condemned as thought's retreat from the common world into supposedly higher realms. Arendt's study of Rahel Varnhagen, a German Jewish writer who converted to Christianity, examined what admission into society costs the Jew who seeks it through self-erasure. Varnhagen became Arendt's first instrument for thinking about failed emancipation. And in 1933, when Hitler came to power, reflection acquired a deadline. Arendt began gathering evidence of Nazi anti-Semitism, was arrested in the summer of that year. Released within days, she fled Germany and reached Paris that autumn. The central controversy of Arendt's career concerned her claims about Jewish leaders' roles in compiling lists and administering deportations. Mr. Meyer's recovery of Arendt's work within Jewish institutions is meant partly to answer those who accused her of indifference to Jewish faith. Yet it also makes her stance here harder, not easier to explain. She knew from within how such groups operated amid extreme danger. Still, she imposed what Norman Potter's called an inordinate demand that Jews under Hitler be braver and nobler than ordinary people could be expected to be when murderers held all the power. It was in this context that Gershom Scheim, who had worked beside her at Jewish cultural reconstruction, accused her of lacking Ahavat Yisrael, love for the Jewish people. Their quarrel was not over when the rent belonged to that people, but over what such belonging required of judgment. She replied that she loved friends, not peoples. Belonging for her could not mean suspending criticism. She mistrusted the comfort of a collective identity, yet when attacked as a Jew, she insisted on answering as one. The life Mr. Meyer reconstructs reads as a stained revolt against the power of categories to diminish. He shows her ideas taking shape at desks, where classifications opened or foreclosed futures, within organizations charged with apportioning the remnants of an inheritance among the living. Seen against that history, her arguments no longer seem to descend from the altitude of solitary thought. They bear the abrasion of files handled, claims contested, and Jewish allegiance translated from words to work. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the August 8th and 9th issue of the Wall Street Journal Review. We read from the Wall Street Journal Review every Thursday at 7 p.m. Your reader has been Jeff Shapiro. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the New York Times. At 9 o'clock, we have Harper's Magazine. And at 10 o'clock is episode number 2 of Daughter of Egypt by Marie Benedict. Stay with us for these readings and more. If you or people you know shop at any of the Dash's supermarkets, please save Dash's register tapes for radio reading. Our agency receives $2 for every $100 in Dash's register tapes. Radio reading has raised thousands of dollars so far. Anyone can drop off their Dash's tapes to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service at 1199 Harlem Road, Cheektowaga, between William and Clinton Streets. Or Dash's tapes can be mailed to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service at 1199 Harlem Road, Cheektowaga, New York, 14227. Any questions on Dash's tapes for radio reading? Call us at 716-821-5555, and thanks for caring. The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability,